Star Trek made Enterprise's topple the new Dax, but her story may never be finished. When Star Trek Enterprise first aired in 2001, its Vulcan first officer Topple quickly became one of the most compelling figures in the prequel series. Played with cool precision and emotional depth by Jolene Blalock, Topple was designed as a bridge character, an outsider to humanity who gradually grew closer to Captain Archer and his crew. Yet over the course of 4 seasons, her arc evolved into something richer and more complicated than anyone could have expected. By the end of Enterprise, Topple had arguably become the 22nd century version of Jadzia and Ezri Dax from Star Trek Deep Space Nine, a character carrying layers of identity, trauma, and unfinished journeys, defined as much by what wasn't resolved as by what was. Topple was Enterprise's new Dax, but unlike her DS9 predecessors, her story was cut short. Because Enterprise ended abruptly in its 4th season, many of the threads seeded for her, including her struggles with addiction, her fragile ties to Vulcan tradition, and her deep if doomed connection to Trip Tucker, never found satisfying closure. And as Star Trek continues to look forward rather than back, Topple may remain one of the franchise's most incomplete, yet tantalizingly complex, characters. T'Pol's role echoed Dax's hybrid identity. In Deep Space Nine, Jadzia and later Ezri Dax embodied a unique Star Trek archetype, the fusion of multiple lives, personalities, and perspectives. As a joined Trill, Dax was never just one person, but the host of centuries of memories and experiences. This gave her storylines a unique sense of depth as she wrestled with questions of identity, selfhood, and responsibility to both the past and the present. Topple, though not a Trill, found herself navigating a similar liminal space. She was a Vulcan assigned to a human crew long before her species considered humanity ready for space exploration. This alone set her apart, forcing her to live between two worlds, Vulcan logic and human emotionalism. Much like Dax balancing the voices of prior hosts with her own, Topple carried the weight of Vulcan expectations while being drawn to human openness. Over time, she developed something akin to a hybrid identity, never fully at home in either sphere. The parallel becomes clearer when considering how both characters represented generational bridges. Dax was literally a bridge across lifetimes. Topple symbolized the bridge between Vulcan aloofness and humanity's potential, embodying the earliest steps toward the Federation. Their arcs were about connection, integration, and the painful cost of existing between worlds. The Trellium D addiction, a symbiont in all but name. One of T'Pol's most daring storylines came in Enterprise Season 3, when she deliberately exposed herself to Trellium D, a compound toxic to Vulcans. While meant to shield the ship from anomalies in the Delphic expanse, Trellium had an unintended effect on Topple. It lowered her Vulcan emotional barriers, allowing her to feel in ways she never had before. This became an addiction storyline, with Topple risking her health and sanity for the intoxicating rush of emotional freedom. It also mirrored Dax's own constant negotiation of multiple identities. For Dax, the struggle was external, the voices of past hosts pressing against her individuality. For Topple, it was internal, the conflict between Vulcan suppression and her yearning for release. T'Pol's addiction scarred her permanently, leaving neurological damage. This meant she could never fully return to the rigid Vulcan she once was. Like Dax, she was forever altered, no longer just the product of her species' traditions, but something hybridized, forced to invent a new identity in the wreckage of her old one. It's not hard to imagine how this could have evolved if Enterprise had continued. Perhaps, like Ezri Dax in DS9's final season, Topple would have been forced to forge a new equilibrium, neither purely Vulcan nor entirely human-influenced, but something new that pointed toward the cultural blending that defined the later Federation. Topple and Trip, the unfinished love story. Dax was also one of Star Trek's most romantic characters. Jadzia's relationship with Worf was one of DS9's emotional cornerstones, and Ezri's unspoken bond with Bashir gave her story an added bittersweetness. Both versions of Dax explored how connection could complicate identity. T'Pol's relationship with Commander Trip Tucker served a parallel function. What began as an awkward Vulcan neuropressure subplot blossomed into one of the series' most unexpected love stories. T'Pol's attraction to Trip, emotional, intellectual, and physical, challenged everything she thought she knew about Vulcan discipline. For Trip, the relationship forced him to see beyond stereotypes of Vulcans as cold and unfeeling. Their bond was passionate but tragic, riddled with misunderstandings, cultural clashes, and ultimately grief. In Season 4, their romance was left unresolved, ending with Trip's death in Enterprise's finale. Much like Worf and Jadzia's marriage cut short by her sudden death in DS9, T'Pol's love story was defined as much by what might have been as by what actually occurred. For fans, this was devastating, not just because Trip and T'Pol had become a core emotional thread of the series, but because the conclusion felt rushed and unearned. The echoes of Dax's truncated arcs are clear, a deep emotional investment left hanging by the realities of production schedules and creative decisions. T'Pol's ties to Vulcan politics were a Federation blueprint. Dax often functioned as DS9's political conscience, advising Sisko on Klingon traditions, Cardassian history, or Dominion strategy. Her vast memory made her invaluable in bridging cultural divides. T'Pol similarly played a key political role, especially in Enterprise's later seasons. She became a conduit for Vulcan reform, caught between the rigid, isolationist High Command and the more open-minded factions advocating cooperation with humanity. Her mother's role in Vulcan political upheaval tied T'Pol personally to the changes that would eventually make Vulcan a founding Federation world. Here again, she mirrored Dax, the character who bore the burden of history and used it to guide others into a better future. Unfortunately, Enterprise ended just as Vulcan's transformation was beginning, leaving T'Pol's potential as a bridge to Federation politics mostly unexplored. In many ways, T'Pol was poised to become the franchise's living embodiment of cultural synthesis. Where Dax was the literal embodiment of multiplicity, T'Pol would have been the symbolic precursor of the Federation's ethos, infinite diversity in infinite combinations. Why T'Pol's story may never be finished. The tragedy of T'Pol's character is that Enterprise ended prematurely, just as her arc was hitting its stride. Unlike Dax, who had 7 seasons and 2 incarnations to explore identity, love, loss, and legacy, T'Pol was cut off mid-transformation. Since then, Star Trek has rarely looked back at Enterprise. While Strange New Worlds has revisited parts of Pike's era, and Discovery jumped into the far future, T'Pol's time in the 22nd century has remained largely untouched. Jolene Blalock has also distanced herself from the franchise, making a return less likely. Even if T'Pol were to appear in another series or novel, it's unclear whether the full weight of her unfinished journey could ever be captured. In a sense, this incompleteness has become part of her legacy. T'Pol embodies unrealized potential, the Vulcan who almost redefined her people, the lover who almost found happiness, the Starfleet pioneer who almost found peace with herself. She is Star Trek's great what if.